A critical piece of physical evidence sits in an out-of-state laboratory while federal databases return absolute silence regarding a violent extraction that occurred right on a residential doorstep. The immediate failure to apprehend a highly equipped tactical suspect is not a testament to criminal genius, but a glaring exposure of systemic multi-agency logistical breakdowns. The individual captured on digital forensics was not a ghost, but a physical presence carrying a very specific 25-liter Ozark Trail backpack. Yet the manhunt has stalled completely. The forensic reality is that local infrastructure was immediately overwhelmed by the sheer volume of data and the decentralized nature of modern crime solving. When critical DNA evidence requires out-of-state transport just to be processed against the national database, the entire concept of a rapid response protocol dissolves into bureaucratic friction. This investigation forces us to ask a central analytical question. Is the suspect successfully evading capture because of his own meticulous planning, or is he simply slipping through the massive operational gaps created when local police, federal agencies, and the Department of Justice fail to synchronize their intelligence silos? The structural friction of this manhunt reveals how local ground units and federal data analysts struggle to communicate effectively during a severe crisis. The evidence does not care about internet rumors or public speculation. If you want the forensic facts as they stand in court and want to understand how jurisdictional conflicts derail active cases, subscribe to Crime with John and let us analyze what these agencies are actually doing. We must analyze the foundational elements of this specific jurisdictional conflict. The delays are not born from a lack of dedication, but from a rigid adherence to procedural mandates that were never designed for a rapid tactical deployment against an unknown, heavily equipped aggressor. The sheer weight of interagency paperwork required to move a single piece of biological evidence across state lines creates an insurmountable operational bottleneck. This bottleneck allows the physical trail to degrade and grants the suspect the most valuable asset in any criminal evasion strategy, which is uninterrupted time. The failure to rapidly process the specifics of the 25-liter backpack and cross-reference retail data demonstrates a severe lag in multi-agency data synchronization. We must look at the structural reality of the crime scene before examining the resulting procedural chaos. The baseline vulnerability of the target presents a stark anomaly when compared to the tactical execution of the breach. The victim is Nancy Guthrie, an 84-year-old resident of the Catalina Foothills. The critical factor here is not her age, but her documented medical baseline. She is a vulnerable adult, heavily dependent on daily cardiac medication and a functioning pacemaker. This establishes a rigid biological clock that law enforcement must race against. Every passing hour without her medication fundamentally alters her survivability matrix and shifts the investigative priority from a standard missing persons case to an acute medical emergency. The suspect profile contrasts violently with this physical vulnerability. Digital forensics eventually revealed an individual equipped with a ski mask, heavy gloves, and a handgun holster. Why would a heavily equipped tactical suspect initiate contact with an 84-year-old woman requiring daily cardiac medication? According to local news affiliates, the working law enforcement theory suggests this may have been a botched burglary rather than a targeted abduction. If we accept the botched burglary theory, we must confront the alarming reality that a random property crime escalated into a highly organized extraction. This theory requires us to analyze the geographical isolation of the Catalina Foothills and the specific vulnerabilities of residential properties in that sector. The quiet jurisdiction relies on a decentralized forensic network, entirely unequipped for the rapid response demanded by Guthrie and her severe medical dependencies. The lack of immediate centralized forensic processing facilities in the county means that every piece of physical evidence, from touch DNA to digital cloud storage, is subject to logistical delays. When a victim requires daily cardiac medication and relies on a pacemaker, the standard 72-hour investigative window is a luxury the agencies do not possess. The suspect brought a holster and tactical gear to a location occupied by a medically fragile octogenarian. This specific anomaly suggests either a catastrophic failure in victim profiling by the suspect or a deeply disturbing level of premeditation that contradicts the botched burglary theory entirely. If the suspect was merely seeking property, why execute a forced abduction of a victim who represents a massive logistical liability? An 84-year-old hostage with a pacemaker requires continuous pharmacological maintenance, making her the worst possible target for a prolonged concealment strategy. The tension here lies in the intersection of criminal intent and multi-agency limitation. The local police force is built for community policing and standard investigative procedures, not for hunting a tactically proficient individual who understands how to exploit surveillance blind spots. The delay in establishing a unified command structure highlights a terrifying unease. The local systems designed to protect the most vulnerable residents are structurally incapable of matching the speed of a tactically equipped aggressor. The decentralized nature of the forensic processing practically guarantees that the biological clock of the victim will run out before the bureaucratic clock of the investigation even begins to yield actionable intelligence. The entire system is operating on a delayed timeline, while the medical reality of the victim demands absolute immediacy. The lack of an integrated rapid response network leaves the investigators constantly trailing the physical evidence. By the time a local detective secures the proper authorization to request federal assistance, the tactical suspect has already capitalized on the jurisdictional confusion. This structural unease permeates the entire case file, demonstrating that the greatest threat to a successful resolution is not always the cunning of the perpetrator, but the sluggish machinery of the justice system itself. The timeline of the physical breach confirms this lethal asymmetry and exposes the initial forensic vulnerabilities of the crime scene. On the evening of January 31st, 2026, Nancy Guthrie was forcibly taken from her property. The immediate physical footprint left at the scene was minimal but highly indicative of a violent struggle. Investigators documented blood evidence located directly on the front porch. The presence of blood fundamentally elevates the forensic requirements of the crime scene response. Blood spatter, analysis, volume, and distribution can indicate the severity of the initial trauma, but processing this biological evidence requires immediate and specialized laboratory attention. Alongside the physical biological transfer, a crucial piece of digital evidence was generated, but it was not immediately actionable. Digital forensic specialists eventually recovered previously inaccessible Ring camera footage from the property. The fact that the footage was initially inaccessible points to the complexities of cloud-based security systems and the legal or technical hurdles involved in rapid data extraction. When the footage was finally processed, it provided a chilling visual confirmation of the threat. The video shows the suspect equipped with tactical gear, including the aforementioned handgun holster and heavy gloves, actively tampering with the doorbell mechanism. The act of tampering with the surveillance equipment demonstrates a premeditated awareness of digital security measures. This was not a panicked intruder, but an individual methodically attempting to blind the property before the breach. The delayed recovery of this footage means the suspect had a significant head start before his physical description and tactical loadout were even known to the Joint Task Force. The joint investigation between local police and the Federal Bureau of Investigation officially commenced on February 1st, 2026, but the critical hours between the evening abduction and the deployment of federal resources represent a massive operational void. The immediate physical footprint confirmed a violent tactical extraction, but the subsequent delay in processing the digital evidence opened a critical window for operational chaos. We must examine the specific forensic implications of the front porch evidence. The blood located at the point of entry is the most critical biological marker available to the investigators. However, without immediate access to advanced hematological profiling, the local authorities could only confirm the occurrence of a physical altercation. They could not immediately determine whether the blood belonged to the victim or the aggressor. This delay in biological categorization prevents the task force from accurately assessing the medical urgency of the suspect versus the victim. If the blood belongs to the suspect, it represents a direct pathway to identification via federal databases. If it belongs to the 84-year-old victim, it drastically accelerates the already critical biological clock established by her pacemaker and medication. requirements. The recovery of the Ring camera footage further emphasizes the disparity between the occurrence of a crime and the utilization of its digital footprint. The suspect was captured wearing a ski mask and a holster, clearly indicating a readiness for lethal force, yet the encryption protocols and cloud storage access delays inherent in proprietary residential security systems meant that this visual intelligence was locked away during the most crucial phase of the manhunt. By the time the digital forensics team successfully bypassed these technical barriers and distributed the image of the tactical suspect, the physical perimeter had long since collapsed. The suspect had effectively utilized the technological friction of the security apparatus to mask his initial escape. The evening of January 31st, 2026, thus represents a cascade of delayed intelligence, where physical blood evidence and critical digital surveillance were structurally quarantined from the active ground search. The immediate physical footprint confirmed a violent tactical extraction, but the subsequent delay in processing the digital evidence opened a critical window for operational chaos. This precise window of chaos is where the suspect managed to sever his connection to the immediate crime scene and transition into the wider geographic environment. The failure to instantly synchronize the porch evidence with the digital footage allowed the tactical aggressor to navigate the initial police response completely unchallenged by any specific identifying parameters. During this window of operational chaos, the physical trail began to manifest, but in a location that further complicated the geographical scope of the search. Discarded heavy gloves were discovered exactly 2 miles away from the primary crime scene. The location of these gloves suggests a specific egress route and a deliberate shedding of forensic liabilities by the suspect. Extracting DNA from discarded garments exposed to environmental elements is a highly delicate procedure requiring advanced secondary transfer DNA analysis. Because of the local forensic bottleneck, this critical biological evidence had to be packaged, logged, and shipped to an out-of-state lab for extraction and processing. This multi-day delay in obtaining a DNA profile is a catastrophic failure in a time-sensitive abduction case. When the laboratory finally extracted a usable DNA profile, the results compounded the investigative stall in a deeply troubling manner. The extracted DNA yielded no match in the federal database. It did not match the victim, her immediate contacts, or anyone currently cataloged in the vast federal criminal registry. The physical trail effectively went cold inside an out-of-state database server, leaving a massive procedural vacuum. If the suspect is a ghost to the federal system, how do local agencies with limited resources identify a man hidden behind a ski mask? The absence of a national database hit strips the investigation of its primary modern tool, forcing a reversion to rudimentary ground intelligence gathering. The gloves found 2 miles away represent the exact perimeter of the suspect's confirmed physical footprint. Beyond that 2-mile marker, the evidence dissipates entirely. The sheer logistics of shipping biological material across state lines highlights the core thesis of this investigation. The jurisdictional infrastructure is actively hindering the pursuit. While the physical evidence was traveling via secure transport, the suspect was granted days of unmonitored movement. The failure of the national database to provide an immediate identification means the suspect possesses either no prior felony convictions or a highly sophisticated operational security protocol that has previously kept him entirely off the federal radar. Both possibilities present a nightmare scenario for the Joint Task Force. A suspect with no criminal record is virtually invisible to forensic algorithms, while a suspect who knows how to evade database entry is a highly capable adversary. The revelation that the primary biological evidence generated absolutely zero leads forces the entire investigation to pivot from physical science back to digital speculation. The out-of-state laboratory processing delay, followed by the negative national database result, created an informational void that local law enforcement could not fill with actionable intelligence. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does the internet. When official channels fail to produce immediate forensic results, public speculation aggressively rushes in to fill the void. This transition from a forensic manhunt to a decentralized public spectacle alters the entire trajectory of the case. Drop your structural theories on multi-agency investigations in the comments below as we examine how this critical information vacuum completely derailed the Joint Task Force and shifted the focus from a tactical suspect to a digital circus. The revelation regarding the discarded gloves also raises profound questions about the suspect's psychological state and tactical discipline. Discarding physical evidence just 2 miles from the point of extraction suggests either a calculated transfer to a secondary vehicle or a sudden breakdown in operational security. However, because the biological extraction process was delayed by the out-of-state transfer, investigators could not immediately capitalize on this potential vulnerability. The timeline was fractured. The physical evidence was geographically isolated, the digital evidence was technically delayed, and the biological evidence was bureaucratically quarantined. This trifecta of systemic failure perfectly illustrates how jurisdictional boundaries and resource limitations can inadvertently protect a violent aggressor. The lack of a database match was the final structural blow to the initial rapid response protocol. The physical trail went cold in an out-of-state server. Nature abhors a vacuum. Drop your structural theories on multi-agency investigations in the comments below as we examine how this information vacuum derailed the task force. As the physical and digital trails stalled, the multi-agency task force began to severely fragment under the weight of jurisdictional boundaries and unprecedented public interference. The division of labor seemed logical on paper but proved disastrous in execution. The local sheriff department was tasked with managing local ground searches and processing an overwhelming influx of public information. They received over 18,000 unverified tips. Processing 18,000 pieces of unverified data requires massive manpower, pulling deputies away from proactive physical searches and forcing them into highly reactive administrative roles. The sheer volume of noise effectively paralyzed the local intelligence apparatus. Simultaneously, the Federal Bureau of Investigation took jurisdiction over the complex digital forensics, including the delayed surveillance analysis and the out-of-state biological coordination. This separation of duties created strict intelligence silos where local ground units might not have immediate access to the latest federal analytical conclusions. Furthermore, the Department of Justice had to step in to manage entirely separate but parallel criminal activity that suddenly emerged in the wake of the abduction. The fragmented approach meant that no single agency had total, unimpeded control over both the tactical manhunt and the massive data filtering process. As the agencies struggled to synchronize their data silos, an entirely fabricated, public-driven narrative began to actively siphon resources away from the physical investigation. The DOJ was forced to allocate federal resources to investigate cross-state extortion crimes related to the case. This required initiating federal proceedings against secondary actors who were actively exploiting the crisis for financial gain. The true crime community and amateur online sleuths began generating their own unverified theories, completely detached from the confirmed forensic reality of the case. This digital vigilantism created a secondary crisis that law enforcement was forced to manage simultaneously with the active abduction protocol. The public, the very entity meant to facilitate valid tips and act as the eyes and ears of the community, became the primary logistical obstacle. The 18,000 tips were largely not actionable intelligence, but a mountain of digital noise that actively buried the tactical suspect's actual escape route. Instead of analyzing the egress path associated with the discarded gloves or tracking the purchase history of the specific backpack, investigators were forced to spend critical man-hours investigating baseless internet rumors. The structural friction of this manhunt is a direct result of this fragmentation. Local ground units, federal data analysts, and the overwhelming noise generated by amateur sleuths created a systemic strain that solely benefited the masked suspect. We must examine the psychological and logistical toll of the 18,000 unverified tips. Each tip legally requires a baseline level of verification to prevent liability and ensure no genuine lead is ignored. This mandates the deployment of trained investigators to conduct interviews, review secondary footage, and cross-reference geographical data for scenarios that are entirely fictitious. When a local department is already struggling with the lack of centralized forensic processing, this administrative burden becomes catastrophic. The federal involvement, while necessary for high-level database access, further complicates the chain of command. The Federal Bureau of Investigation operates on strict procedural guidelines that do not always align with the immediate tactical needs of local sheriffs. When the DOJ enters the matrix to prosecute secondary extortion offenses, the investigative focus is split between recovering an 84-year-old victim and building federal indictments against opportunists residing in completely different states. The masked suspect, armed with a holster and protected by gloves, relies entirely on this exact type of systemic chaos. The suspect does not need to outsmart the combined intellect of the federal government. He simply needs to outpace their bureaucratic processing speed and let the public generate enough static to mask his movements. The jurisdictional conflicts are not merely a background detail, they are the primary mechanism secretly derailing the entire investigation. The massive influx of public interference operates as an unintended smokescreen for the aggressor. The multi-agency task force was designed to bring overwhelming force against a single target, but instead it became bogged down in its own complex architecture and the relentless onslaught of fabricated public data. The systemic failure is absolute. Hit the notification bell to track the ongoing forensic breakdown and understand how jurisdictional gridlock affects active cases. The reality of modern crime solving is heavily dependent on seamless data integration and immediate public cooperation. In this specific investigation, both of those foundational pillars collapsed simultaneously. The out-of-state laboratory delays the federal database. Failures, the local administrative paralysis, and the overwhelming digital interference all combine to create a perfect storm of operational inefficiency. Hit the notification bell to track the ongoing forensic breakdown and understand how jurisdictional gridlock affects active true crime investigations. As the physical manhunt completely stalled, the operational focus was forcibly redirected toward a bizarre secondary crisis, manufactured entirely by external actors. The severe vulnerability of the abducted resident and the high-profile nature of the tactical breach created an irresistible magnet for opportunistic predators operating far outside local jurisdiction. This complication materialized not on the streets of the targeted neighborhood, but through interstate telecommunications networks. A California man identified in federal documents as 42-year-old Derek Catalina actively chose to inject himself into the most critical phase of the search. Catalina is formally accused of orchestrating a cruel and legally disruptive campaign by sending a series of fabricated ransom messages directly to the grieving relatives. This was not merely a psychological torment for the family, but a massive logistical assault on the Joint Task Force. When a ransom demand is received during an active disappearance, it instantly triggers a specialized sequence of federal protocols. Hostage negotiators, digital tracking specialists, and interstate wire fraud units must be immediately deployed to verify the threat matrix. Law enforcement personnel were forced to divert immense technical resources to trace the origin of the cellular signals, completely halting the primary forensic momentum. They had to treat the messages as legitimate until conclusively proven otherwise, because ignoring a potentially genuine demand could result in immediate fatal consequences for the missing senior citizen. The agonizing hours spent authenticating and eventually disproving the California communications allowed the actual perpetrator to increase his geographic distance unhindered. Catalina faced federal indictment for this profound interference, but the operational damage was already permanently inflicted upon the investigative timeline. The jurisdictional nightmare expanded exponentially as the digital noise grew louder. While federal agents chased fraudulent data packets across state lines, local authorities faced an equally destructive wave of interference from the true crime community itself. Amateur online investigators possessing absolutely zero access to the classified case files decided to construct their own highly damaging narrative. They aggressively targeted the son-in-law of the victim, Tommaso Cioni. Without a single piece of verifiable physical trace, armchair detectives flooded social media platforms with baseless accusations labeling him the prime suspect. This digital vigilantism mutated from internet speculation into real-world harassment, forcing the local law enforcement apparatus into an entirely defensive posture. To formally clear an individual of suspicion, detectives cannot simply rely on intuition. They must exhaustively document alibis, pull electronic toll records, analyze historical cell tower dumps, and conduct rigorous secondary doc interviews. Every single hour spent verifying the innocence of the son-in-law was an hour stolen from the pursuit of the masked aggressor. The overwhelming pressure from internet communities forced the hand of the lead investigator. On February 16th, Sheriff Chris Nanos had to step before the media and utilize highly valuable press conference bandwidth to publicly address the internet rumors. Instead of using the broadcast to disseminate actionable intelligence about the perpetrator's height estimated at 5 feet 9 inches or his medium build, the sheriff was forced to categorically clear Sione and the rest of the family of any involvement. He had to explicitly command the public to stop hindering the active pursuit. This press conference represents a critical anomaly in the modern criminal justice ecosystem. The public, which should serve as a vital force multiplier for investigators, had effectively become an active adversary. The investigative machinery was grinding to a halt not because the tactical suspect was a criminal mastermind, but because the combined agencies were suffocating under the weight of malicious fabrications and fraudulent financial schemes. The immense energy required to dismantle the conspiracy theory surrounding the relatives drained the exact personnel meant to be conducting rigorous neighborhood canvasses and reviewing peripheral surveillance networks. The investigation entered a dark valley where the genuine perpetrator remained entirely invisible while opportunistic criminals and internet speculators dominated the forensic spotlight. The structural integrity of the Joint Task Force was actively crumbling under the pressure of managing public perception rather than hunting a violent fugitive. The cruelest irony of this procedural valley is the passage of time. While specialized units were busy drafting federal indictments against an extortionist in a different state, and local sheriffs were engaged in public relations battles regarding innocent relatives, the biological reality of the captive remained completely unchanged. Her critical need for pharmacological maintenance was totally overshadowed by the digital circus surrounding the case. The friction of jurisdiction and public interference had created a perfect acoustic shield for the attacker. Hit the notification bell to track how this unprecedented digital interference continues to shield the real perpetrator. The consequences of this administrative paralysis culminated weeks later in a moment of intense geographical and forensic confusion. By late March, the multi-agency operation had essentially flatlined, yielding no credible sightings and no secondary physical trace matching the initial extraction. The informational void was suddenly shattered by a grim discovery far outside their immediate jurisdiction. On March 28th, authorities recovered an adult female body from a canal system in Scottsdale. Given the lack of progress near the original extraction zone, the immediate assumption across news networks and social channels was that the prolonged search had finally reached its tragic conclusion. Scottsdale is located roughly 120 miles north of the initial crime scene, presenting a geographical shift that would heavily suggest the suspect utilized major interstate corridors to dispose of the liability. However, local police and medical examiners conclusively stated that the recovered remains were completely unlinked to the ongoing investigation. The Scottsdale discovery was a massive false peak that forced the regional task force to confront a terrifying reality. The definitive ruling by the medical examiner meant that the elderly captive was still utterly unaccounted for, and the tactical aggressor was still entirely hidden from the surveillance grid. This moment serves as the ultimate analytical climax of the entire investigation because it perfectly crystallizes the core thesis of the failure. The complete lack of progress over 2 agonizing months cannot be attributed to a singular genius maneuver by the suspect. It is the direct mathematical result of a catastrophic systemic breakdown. When you combine the initial delay of distant laboratory processing with the logistical nightmare of tracking fraudulent telecommunications demands and multiply that by the thousands of man-hours wasted debunking internet theories about Tommaso Sione, the equation equals absolutely zero actionable intelligence. The official clearing of the family members formally closed the door on any simple domestic resolution. The perpetrator did not vanish into thin air utilizing advanced espionage tactics. He slipped right through the massive procedural cracks created when municipal, state, and federal agencies fail to seamlessly integrate their intelligence networks. The intense static generated by the public provided the exact acoustic cover necessary for a quiet, methodical escape. We must understand that the modern justice system is highly reactive by design. It relies heavily on existing registries, cell phone tower pings, and electronic financial transactions to build a retrospective map of criminal behavior. But when a target actively avoids triggering those digital tripwires and the physical material yields absolutely no matches in the national registry, the entire technological advantage of law enforcement instantly collapses. The combined agencies are left with nothing but an estimated physical stature of 5 feet 9 inches, a medium build, and the knowledge of a generic retail rucksack. This case violently exposes the grand illusion of the omnipotent federal task force. The security monitors captured the initial breach. The federal government deployed its vast resources, and the entire nation watched closely, yet the suspect walked away completely untouched. This is the horrifying reality of multi-jurisdictional friction. The system is incredibly efficient at prosecuting known digital entities like the extortionist, but it is fundamentally incapable of rapidly identifying an unknown tactical threat who operates strictly outside the expected parameters of modern digital life. The definitive failure to produce a suspect profile forces us to revisit the early law enforcement assumption of a randomized property. Crime gone wrong. The events of March 28th and the total silence of the federal databases obliterate that comforting assumption. A disorganized thief caught off guard by a resident does not possess the operational discipline to completely evade a massive federal manhunt for months. A panicked intruder makes mistakes, leaves digital footprints, and eventually surfaces in the local criminal ecosystem. The individual who orchestrated this event demonstrated a terrifying level of patience and a flawless understanding of how to exploit the seams between different law enforcement jurisdictions. The realization that this was a highly calculated and perfectly executed operation is the ultimate revelation that the initial theories desperately tried to avoid. The agencies were hunting a ghost while assuming they were looking for a common criminal. The failure to locate the captive or identify the masked individual is not a strange anomaly, but rather the expected outcome of a highly fragmented infrastructure that was successfully overwhelmed by external noise. Share this analysis to combat the rampant true crime misinformation that is currently paralyzing active cases and inadvertently protecting violent offenders from justice. The intense multi-agency mobilization that characterized the first weeks of the manhunt eventually collided with the harsh, unforgiving realities of municipal resource management. As the calendar turned and the initial promising leads completely evaporated, the sprawling Joint Task Force inevitably began to scale back its dedicated daily presence. Local deputies who had been entirely consumed by the massive influx of unverified public tips were gradually forced to return to their standard routine community policing duties. Federal agents whose highly specialized digital skills are constantly required for fresh crises across the nation slowly withdrew their active ground support from the region. The intense investigation subtly transitioned from an acute, high-speed tactical pursuit into a deeply frustrating cold administrative file. The urgent biological countdown that defined the fragile survival matrix of the victim was never officially answered. It was simply absorbed into the grim, quiet statistics of unsolved permanent disappearances. The tactical suspect remains entirely unidentified, existing only as a faceless entity defined by a handful of items, permanently logged in the secure evidence room. The confirmed physical description of a male standing 5 feet 9 inches, with a medium build equipped with thermal hand protection, a specialized firearm retention device, and that specific commercial equipment bag is practically useless without a concrete database anchor to attach it to. These isolated physical descriptors represent the absolute maximum limit of the combined agency's forensic reach. They are currently trapped in a cold storage filing cabinet, unable to generate any new investigative momentum or trigger any new electronic alerts. The evidence log is no longer an active tool, but a historical record of failure. The precise volume capacity of the bag and the specific weave of the discarded materials are meticulously documented facts that lead absolutely nowhere. When the forensic science stalls and the digital trail is completely absent, detectives are forced to rely on the passage of time, hoping the perpetrator eventually makes a mistake in a separate, unrelated crime. This passive strategy is a devastating admission of defeat. The system must wait for the ghost to materialize on his own terms because they lack the offensive capability to force him out of the shadows. The case file remains officially open on a technicality, but the reality on the ground is that the pursuit has effectively ended. The agonizing resolution of this particular case is the realization that there will be no cinematic conclusion or dramatic final courtroom verdict. There is only a profound and deeply unsettling silence. The vast law enforcement system slowly returned to its standard baseline operations, leaving a massive unresolved void in the affluent suburban community. The grieving relatives are left to constantly navigate a state of traumatic ambiguity, fully knowing that the individual responsible successfully defeated the entire spectrum of modern law enforcement technology. The structural failure explicitly demonstrated here practically guarantees that the perpetrator is still operating freely out there, heavily emboldened by his total success and now fully aware of the precise blind spots within the complex jurisdictional grid. He learned exactly how many days it takes for vital biological material to cross state borders for basic processing, and he witnessed firsthand how easily the general public can be manipulated into unintentionally obstructing the police response. The various agencies fundamentally failed to synchronize their specific, specialized efforts, and the ultimate price of that bureaucratic fragmentation was the permanent loss of an incredibly vulnerable senior citizen. This quiet, methodical fading of the active investigation leaves us with a terrifying and deeply chilling open question. If a tactically proficient suspect can execute a violent extraction directly on camera, entirely bypass the National Federal Registry, and effectively utilize the inherent chaos of a decentralized response system to disappear completely, what exactly prevents him from perfectly replicating this precise operational blueprint in another quiet, unsuspecting suburban jurisdiction tomorrow? The architectural blueprint for successful evasion has been perfectly field tested, and the combined authorities have clearly proven they do not currently possess the structural capacity to counter it. We are left staring blankly at the unyielding facts of a frozen case, where the rigid architecture of the justice system itself inadvertently provided the ultimate operational sanctuary for a violent, untraceable offender. What this case teaches us about the modern true crime ecosystem is that structural efficiency is infinitely more valuable than raw manpower. The practical forensic lesson here centers entirely on the devastating vulnerability of decentralized evidence processing. When secondary transfer DNA collected from discarded garments must be shipped across state lines just to interface with a federal database, the concept of a rapid tactical deployment is fundamentally shattered. This specific logistical delay illustrates a critical flaw in regional law enforcement architecture. A local agency may possess the legal jurisdiction to investigate a violent crime, but if they lack the immediate centralized laboratory infrastructure to process the physical trace elements, they will always be mathematically outpaced by a prepared offender. Furthermore, this particular investigation demands a rigorous analytical assessment of how massive public interaction legally and logistically obstructs active joint task forces. The online true crime community often views itself as a collaborative extension of law enforcement, aiming to crowdsource justice through awareness. However, the verified facts of this devastating multi-agency failure prove that unchecked digital vigilantism actively degrades the structural integrity of a manhunt. When federal prosecutors must spend vital time indicting opportunistic individuals for fabricated ransom demands and local sheriffs are forced to expend crucial resources explicitly debunking baseless internet rumors, the general public ceases to be a helpful asset and instantly becomes a severe operational liability. The dangerous intersection of delayed forensic science and overwhelming public interference creates a perfect storm that actively shields suspects. We must analyze these cases not as entertaining mysteries, but as critical structural stress tests of our legal and investigative systems. Understanding the precise friction points between local authorities, federal data analysts, and online communities is the only way to accurately evaluate why certain perpetrators remain completely untraceable despite massive technological advancements. The absolute absence of a national database hit leaves us staring at a deeply unsettling reality regarding the masked aggressor. We are left with the chilling tactical profile of an individual who systematically defeated multiple layers of modern security and forensic analysis. He utilized specialized equipment, maintained strict operational discipline, and successfully navigated the complex geographical boundaries that dictate how law enforcement responds to a crisis. If the biological markers are simply not registered in the system and local infrastructure is continually overwhelmed by an uncontrollable flood of external digital noise, the fundamental question of accountability remains entirely unanswered. Who actually owns the operational jurisdiction of finding a ghost when the combined resources of the state and federal government cannot even agree on how to rapidly process the limited evidence left behind? The vast architecture of the justice system was inadvertently weaponized against itself, allowing a highly capable predator to walk away from a heavily monitored residential grid. The physical forensic trail is completely frozen, but our analytical pursuit of the truth never stops. Subscribe to Crime with John for the next comprehensive case file analysis, where we will continue to deeply dissect the complex structural realities of the criminal justice system.